Hello, and welcome to this edition of People in Transition. I'm your host, Bob Gerst. I've been hiring and mentoring executives, frontline employees, and job seekers for nearly 40 years through a host of transitions, some difficult, but most very good. This experience has given me a bird's eye view on a variety of trends, economies, industry disruptors, and transitions, big and small. It also brought me into contact with the thought leaders and decision makers you need to meet. Imagine knowing exactly what to do next and how to know it's time to make your big job change. We all know transitions can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. And it's even fun when you have actionable strategies and proven tactics to achieve the future you want. We'll share with you the tools and skills that can take your dreams to your next great job. So if change is on your horizon, you won't want to miss this discussion. Also, please subscribe to this podcast so you won't miss any future episodes. Welcome to another episode of People in Transition. Today, we're thrilled to have Porschia Parker-Griffin with us. Porschia is the founder and CEO of Fly High Coaching, where she empowers ambitious professionals and motivated executives to boost their earnings. As a professional certified coach, a Myers-Briggs type indicator master practitioner, and an Energy Leadership Index master practitioner, Porschia brings a wealth of expertise to the table. She holds a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology from Eastern Kentucky University and a BS in psychology from the University of Georgia. Porschia has also served as an associate training coach for the Institute of Professional Excellence in Coaching and earned top recognition as a top voice and career expert by LinkedIn. Her insights have been featured in prominent outlets like Biospace, Flex Jobs, and iOffice, as well as the Rochester Business Journal. Additionally, Porschia is the host of her own podcast titled the Career 101 Podcast. I am so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you today, Porschia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. I am really excited to be here with you to talk all about transition.
Porschia, one of my signature questions that my listeners enjoy hearing about is, if you could think back when you were a child, what was it that you thought you wanted to be when you grew up?
That is a great question, Bob. There were actually two things that top of mind when I was younger. And so I'll tell you both of them. One was a veterinarian. So I love animals, have always loved animals. So just helping the animals as a vet was one. And then the other thing I wanted to be was an actress. I just thought it would be cool to play other characters that aren't really you.
And Porschia, what were the transition moments that you went through from that point in time as a child that you wanted to be a veterinarian/actress to where you're at today?
Yeah, there were quite a few transition points. I think I'll just give you the top ones. The first one was graduating from college. And so I'm a millennial. I graduated in the depths of the recession. So we know in the United States that there was just so much going on with the economy and all of that. And I decided that instead of going and getting a PhD, because as you mentioned earlier, I was a psychology major. So then by college, I kind of thought about being a counseling psychologist, but my undergraduate degree scrapped that. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to go get a job and try to figure out this working world. So 2 months after graduation, I moved from Georgia to Los Angeles, California, without a job, Bob. So I eventually fell into the world of financial consulting around tax credits and incentives for businesses. That was painfully boring for most people, but I dug really deep into it. And that was, I think, the first really important transition, because working for a small to mid-sized consulting firm as your first kind of real job, you learned so much. Another pivotal transition I would say about 2 to 3 years in, was I transitioned into sales. And so I eventually became a director of business development for that consulting firm and was kind of stressed out, overworked. I had a health scare. And then I said, you know what? If I'm going to be in sales and have this much pressure, I want to be selling something that I'm passionate about, that's really meaningful to me. And so this is the third and last transition I'll mention, which is kind of leading to where I am today, where I decided that I wanted to start my own business and start a coaching business. And so, did a lot of research and found out coaching was what I always wanted to do, but never knew existed, right? From having that psychology background. So started coaching individuals at first around their careers.
Porschia, what I'd like us to do is spend a little bit of time talking about the interviewing process. And what have you seen in your coaching that are some of the major challenges people have when they think of interviewing?
Interviewing is such an important part of the transition. And I love that your show focuses on transitions. It's a step that I think is skipped over a lot. Some of the top challenges I see from our clients, one is being overconfident. I'd say two is not being prepared. And three would be not knowing how to answer questions in a compelling way. I think that interviewing can be really tricky for people because it is by far the number one place that I see people are overconfident. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've heard people tell me, just get me in the room and I can land the job, or just get me in front of the right people and everyone loves me. Or once I get the interview, I don't have any problems getting a job offer. And the problem with those ways of thinking are that you're being overconfident and you're overestimating your own likability while simultaneously underestimating all of the other candidates that are interviewing for the same job. Another common concern I hear about interviewing from clients is that they say, okay, I went to the interview and I answered all the questions that the recruiter asked, but I just don't feel like I knocked it out of the park. They don't feel like the recruiter is walking away thinking that they have to hire them for the job. So it's kind of like they were answering the questions, but maybe not coming across as the most memorable or compelling person for the job. And I've heard people say, well, the interview was okay, right? But I just don't feel great about it. And I tell people that you might have this feeling because maybe the interviewer didn't seem very interested in your answers. And then maybe that interviewer didn't ask very many follow-up questions of you. Maybe you personally just didn't feel great about it. Another clue that, things just went okay is that the recruiter or the interviewer doesn't really seem enthusiastic about next steps or kind of getting in touch with you again.
Porschia, if the challenges that you outlined, overconfident, not being prepared, not knowing how to answer the questions, and there are probably other challenges as well, how do you take the steps necessary to prepare for an interview to deal with those challenges?
Great question. Spoke a little bit about being overconfident in your own abilities and underestimating the other candidates and their background and their experience. But one of the first things that I encourage professionals and executives to do is to reframe their thinking, right? Nowadays, there are usually hundreds of people applying for each job opening that's out there. And there are probably at least 10 people getting an interview. And while you might be a great candidate, it's about showing that in the interview and using your past experience and results to demonstrate that, right? So how can you bring value and show that you're the best person for the role? I'd say the challenge of not being prepared shows up in a lot of different ways. So one thing that I have heard from recruiters myself and also read a lot online is that a lot of people show up to a job interview and ask, so what does this company do? That's a prime example of not being prepared. Before going into a job interview, it's your responsibility to do research on the organization. And I generally think that the more research, the better. You want to have an understanding of the organization, what they do, what their goals are. It's also great if you can understand their vision, mission, and values. And you can just do that research usually pretty simply online. You can also use that information that you get through your research to come up with questions that you would then ask the recruiter or the hiring manager. So there's also a lot of research that you can do about the role, about how it exists within the organization or within the industry that the company is in. So when we work with clients, there really are a myriad of ways that we support them through that. Also, when it comes to developing those compelling responses to interview questions, we've got exercises and guides to do that. But I think some prep work that people can do on their own is to just get really clear on their background, get clear on the specific projects, programs, or initiatives that you were a part of that show how you performed well in the past. I think you also want to make sure that you're avoiding just kind of passively answering interviewing questions. I tell our clients to mention examples of their accomplishments as answers to interview questions without sounding cocky. So this is like a very kind of slick way that you can sneak your achievements into the conversation naturally in a compelling way.
Porschia, I read right now a lot about behavioral interviewing that is taking place by hiring managers, by HR people. Can you describe what is a behavioral interviewing technique, and do I answer those behavioral interview questions somehow differently? Therefore, I should prepare differently for those interviews.
Behavioral interviewing is a practice where the interviewer is asking you questions and really looking for examples of your past behavior to predict your future success in a new role. It actually comes from psychology, where psychologists use that information from the past to predict the future. So that's kind of what it's rooted in. Some people refer to behavioral interviewing as storytelling interviews because they can put you in the situation of telling a story about a specific circumstance and how you acted or performed. The interviewer is typically looking for you to explain your thought process and your actions that you took to achieve success. So with that in mind, often behavioral interviewing questions are technically not questions at all, right? They can be statements designed for you to just provide specific feedback. So in that way, yes, Bob, answering behavioral interviewing questions can be very different than just a standard interview question out there.
Porschia, can you give us an example of what a behavioral interview question might be and how you would suggest someone answer that?
Sure. There are quite a few. One question that people get, and so this is another example of a statement, would be, tell me about a time when you had to successfully navigate deadlines. And so that's a statement. And what they're actually looking for is how well you manage your time, deal with timelines, deadlines, get things done, right? So you would think of a time in your past where maybe you were a part of a project and maybe there was a hard deadline coming up, and you talk about what you did to help the project keep going or get back on track.
What are some effective strategies that I would use as a candidate if I get one of those unexpected questions or a difficult question during the interview? How do I deal with that?
So one thing I recommend people do is to just say out loud, that's a great question. Let me take a moment to think about that. And just saying that, one, gives you time to think about it, but it also prevents kind of the awkward silence, the long pause, so that you can really come up with a compelling answer for the question. So right out the gate, say you want to take a moment to think about it. And part of like the preparation that I recommend our clients do is to be prepared to talk about certain events ahead of time and to talk about events or projects, accomplishments that involved different aspects of your time management skills, leadership, project management, problem solving skills, so that you are prepared to talk about certain scenarios at any point in time so you don't get stumped, right? So it's like coming in with 2 to 3 scenarios that you've already thought about.
Would you ever say, I really can't come up with something to share with you about that issue?
Yes, if it was true. I generally encourage our clients to think of some kind of scenario as an answer, even if it doesn't fit perfectly, something where you can kind of touch on what they're asking and tie it back to what you've done in the past. But if they're asking you specifically about something that you have no experience with, another interviewing technique that I tell our clients is to always end your response on a positive note. So, for example, Bob, if you asked me, Portia, have you used this very specific software program that we use in our department? Maybe I've never used that specific software program before. Instead of just saying, no, Bob, and ending my answer on a negative, I would say something like, while I haven't used that specific software program before, Bob, I have used this software and this software, which I've heard are quite similar. So, with the proper training from the company or people within the department, I'm pretty sure that I would be able to catch on and learn how to use that program. So, an answer like that is better than just saying, no, Bob, I don't know how to use that software program.
Any suggestion in terms of how a candidate would respond to questions about their weaknesses or past failures or gaps in their resume to try to turn that as positive as possible?
With weaknesses first, again, I recommend that our clients have some scenarios thought of ahead of time where maybe things were kind of going off the rails and maybe there were things that you hadn't thought of or that you missed, but a situation where there actually was a positive outcome in the end. And so you can talk about that. You wouldn't want to say something like, oh, I don't have any weaknesses, because that's not realistic. Some clients I've had in the past, they actually don't even like the word weaknesses. They say, oh, some areas of opportunity or some things that I'm working on are, and that's a way to kind of positively reframe the word weakness and what's kind of a more negatively focused question. So that's something there. When it comes to gaps in the resume, I think it's really important to think about why there is a gap. What's great is that nowadays people are very open to hearing about things that are really going on in someone's life. So people moving, people taking care of a sick parent, a sick spouse, a sick child, being laid off, taking, what a lot of people call a career break because of any of those circumstances is not necessarily frowned upon. So you want to have, again, an answer that you've kind of thought of ahead of time that explains that a little bit as to why you took that gap. And then to end on the positive note again, Bob, talk about what you did in the gap that is applicable to that job, right? So maybe during that gap or in your resume, you took that time to get a certification, learn a new skill, get some training in an area, maybe just read a lot of books on a certain topic, right? You can weave that in there as well.
What about soft skills that I might have? Communication, teamwork, adaptability. How do I bring that out during the interview process?
Soft skills are so important. Glad that you mentioned that. They're important when interviewing and then also when thinking about trying to get promoted, right, within a role. So that's another way of kind of interviewing for another role, but just internally. I'll explain this a bit more because I've kind of touched on it before, but this is another great example of how you can really demonstrate your soft skills. So an exercise I like our clients to do is to kind of write out and rehearse how you would talk about 2 to 3 accomplishments during an interview. So some of our clients like to write about their accomplishments in a paragraph style. Some just like to write out some bullet points. Whatever works for you is fine. You want to write about the situation, what was going on. You want to weave in a soft skill, perhaps like communication, leadership, conflict resolution, any of that as to how you help that situation end on a positive note and get a positive result. So if you have 2 to 3 accomplishments, I like to call them in your back pocket, before you go into an interview, you can use those situations to talk about a myriad of different questions that might be asked of you, especially in a behavioral interviewing scenario.
And how about body language, Portia? Is that important during the interview? And how should the candidate be mindful of their body language?
Body language is so important in an interview. A lot of times, interviews are the first impression or second impression that someone has of you, so they don't know you very well. They are consciously and subconsciously making decisions about who you are and the value that you could bring to the role just based on your body language alone. You want to make sure that you have open body language, so your arms aren't crossed. You also want to make sure that you're coming across as approachable and relaxed. So something else that people do a lot of times is that they're kind of leaned in forward or hunched over and leaned in forward towards the camera if it's a virtual interview. That subconsciously puts people in a state of feeling pursued. Instead, you want to make sure that you are kind of leaned back comfortably in your chair, for example. And of course, with that open body language, appearing open, friendly, approachable, all of that.
Portia, are there other ways that you can build a rapport with the interviewer? And what I'm really struggling with sometimes is when you do that interview over Zoom or Skype or whatever, and how do you make that connection?
So, one of the things I encourage our clients to do on the research side is once you have the name of the interviewer or the recruiter, to research them on LinkedIn and to look for any commonalities that you might have with that person. So, did you have the same major in college? Did they ever live in the same state that you lived in? Did they go to the same university, or was that university in the same conference? I mean, you're looking for anything. Are they interested in something you're interested in? Did they do volunteer work for a similar type of organization that you did? Anything. You're looking for a point of commonality. And so once you find that point of commonality, you want to mention that in the interview. And it's usually great to mention that in the kind of introduction, ice-breaking beginning portion of the interview. And that can really go well in terms of building rapport. Another thing that you can do is see if they have a real background, right? Sometimes, people have virtual backgrounds, but if there's a real background, you can pick up clues and start a conversation that way. Do they have books in the background? Do you see musical instruments in the background? Whatever you see in the background, those are all talking points that you can use to build rapport.
Portia, are there key differences between an in-person interview and a virtual interview? And how should the candidate be aware and deal with those differences?
So I think the fundamentals are the same, right? The person, the interviewer, is asking the interviewee questions to assess their fit with a job role. So I think that's the same virtually and in person. However, to your point, there are some other considerations that you want to make depending on if it's in person or virtual. So if it's in person, all of the logistics of actually getting to the location early, parking, making sure that you can get into the building on the right floor, and all of that ahead of time, right? So that you are on time for the interview. And to some people, that sounds like, oh, yeah, duh, doesn't everybody do that? There's so much can happen, especially if you live in a large city. Like I mentioned, when I moved to Los Angeles, I realized very quickly that I had to add at least 30 minutes to everything because of just finding parking. After you get to the location, walking a block or two into the building and then getting up to the right floor. So those are examples of logistical things that you want to make sure if you're doing an in-person interview that you have covered. If it's a virtual interview, the great thing is you don't have the travel time and all that prep, but your other prep should be making sure that you can connect with the technology, right? What platform are they using to host the interview? You want to have done a test run on that. Make sure you can get into the software. Make sure that your microphone and your camera are working. That's the prep work that you should do on your end if it's a virtual interview. So those are just some differences there.
Portia, how should a candidate handle moments in the interview when they realize they've made a mistake somehow, misspoke, something just didn't go right? What should they do with that?
I think the best thing, Bob, is to be honest. And I think it's best if you can kind of catch it either in the moment or close to the time when you feel as though you've made a mistake, and that makes it easier to correct. You can say, well, you know what? On second thought, when I said earlier, da 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 da, I think a better answer, or I think that something that is a better example of what you're looking for is, and then you kind of rephrase it that way. If you think that you've made a mistake, but it was much further back in the interview. So let's say like you're getting towards the end of the interview and you realize, oh my goodness, earlier I said X, Y, and Z, and I think that's wrong now, or I don't think that that's a good fit. Once you get to the end of the interview, a lot of times the interviewer will ask you, oh, do you have any questions for me? And that's when I think you can kind of go back and readdress that issue that you think you might have made a mistake with earlier. So I might say something like, oh, well, Bob, I know earlier we talked a bit about hybrid opportunities versus fully remote opportunities. And I mentioned that, I wanted fully remote opportunities. Are fully remote opportunities available, at this company, or are they all hybrid? You can ask that question and kind of go back. And then if Bob were to tell me that there were only hybrid roles available, then I might say, well, you know what, Bob, thank you for letting me know that. I know I mentioned earlier that I was only open to remote opportunities, but for the right fit, I might be open to hybrid ones as well. And so that's a way that you can kind of go back and perhaps correct things.
Portia, what's the best way to talk about your achievements as a candidate without coming across as arrogant or full of yourself?
I recommend the STAR method for interviewing. And the STAR method is a popular way to answer behavioral interviewing questions. And it involves you providing the background details of a circumstance or project and an overview of your approach and the outcomes. So when you use the STAR method, you can discuss, the who, the what, the where, the when, and how of an experience. Each letter in STAR stands for something. So S stands for situation. And that's where you would describe the context of what was going on with the project or a challenge. T stands for the tasks. So that's where you would explain the responsibilities that you had in your role to address the situation. A stands for action. And that's where you would mention what you did to fix the problem or help the project be successful. And then R stands for result. So this is where you're telling the interviewer about the outcome of the situation. So that outcome might be how your particular contributions influence the results. And then you can talk about your accomplishments there and how they might have surpassed expectation. In addition to the STAR method, what I mentioned before about having those 2 to 3 stories that you've thought about prior to the interview, having those in your back pocket can be really helpful in terms of you preparing. And then if you have 2 to 3 scenarios, then you can answer just about any question that is thrown at you because you've already kind of done that pre-work. And that saves you from being someone who thinks, oh, I've got to memorize 50 different answers to interview questions and have that pressure on yourself. No, if you've just done that pre-work, you've thought about a few scenarios ahead of time, you can practice those. And then that helps your mind not to go blank during an interview.
Portia, what are some of the best practices that you coach your clients for following up after an interview? What should they do?
They should definitely follow up, number one. I think it's important to follow up, and a lot of times in different ways. So if a recruiter originally reached out to you on LinkedIn, you want to send them a thank you note on LinkedIn. If they originally reached out to you via email, you want to send them a thank you email. I read years ago that doing both, so sending that electronic thank you and then also a handwritten note thank you, mailing that to their office or whatever address you can find for them on file, puts you ahead of over 90% of people. I recommend that they do both of those things as part of their follow-up, and then those should be done quickly after the follow-up. And then if you don't hear anything back and the recruiter didn't talk about next steps. So a lot of times recruiters will say, well, you can expect to hear from me in 2 to 3 weeks or a month or whatever timeline they say. If you don't hear from them in that timeline, or if the recruiter or interviewer doesn't give a timeline, then I recommend reaching out proactively somewhere 1 to 2 weeks after that interview.
Portia, are there any books or other resources that you recommend to your clients or others that are trying to find their next great job opportunity?
There are a ton. There are a ton of books on interviewing. I'm sure people can just Google and find. One of my favorite books about your next career opportunity and just thinking about your career differently, whether it be in an interview or not, is the book What Got You Here Won't Get You There by Marshall Goldsmith. A lot of people have heard of it. It's specifically, I think, really helpful for leaders and people who are transitioning into new roles where they might have different responsibilities or different expectations for them.
Portia, we've gone through so much great information here today. If our listeners only remember 3 things, what are the 3 things that you want them to remember?
The first thing is to always be prepared, right? So do your research on your interviewer, who's interviewing you, the company, and in that research, you should always have questions for your interviewer towards the end when they ask if you have questions. So that's number 1. Number 2 would be to think about those 2 to 3 accomplishments, achievements, scenarios, projects, however you think about them from your background. Have that ready to go when you are walking into your interview, so you are sure not to have blank mind moment. And then I would say the third thing is to really understand what I like to call a career support system. So a lot of times people kind of default to, my family members, my friends, my coworkers at my current company. These are the people that'll help me in my interview or help me with my career transition. And while those people may be supportive of you, a lot of times they are biased and they do not have the professional experience to support you in the best way. And then a lot of times your friends and family members and coworkers, they're kind of influenced by how they currently see you. And if they don't see you as someone who can land that next job opportunity or land a promotion, then they actually might not be the best people. So when I say career support system, I'm usually thinking of career coaches, mentors who don't work in your current company, perhaps a peer mentor or other people from professional associations that you have met.
Portia, I believe that you and this podcast is a great part of that career support that you're talking about. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing the tips and techniques that you talk with your clients and others about. I know that this will help people find their next job easier and faster. Thank you, Portia.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you for listening. We're working in unprecedented times. The purpose of these episodes is to give you the support and critical tools to adjust with the changing marketplace. I'll continue to introduce you to guests who have successfully survived their own obstacle course and can share useful information. If today's message was helpful to you, please share it on your social media. Your review and rating helps get this to more people. Also, if you have questions or podcast ideas for future conversations, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Change is constant. The more prepared you are for it, the better and easier the change will occur. Thank you again. This is your host, Bob Gerst. See you at our next episode.